I'm never gonna test anything ever again. I simply wanted to find out which Navy Doctrine is the best one with some tests, but I had to spend 20 hours and I modded half of my game away just so I could get somewhat usable results. Anyway, let's find out which Navy Doctrine is the best one. The sheet is in the doobly-doo. Nothing too surprising here if we take a look at the spreadsheets. Once again, the less important stats are marked in gray. The Navy Spirits, they are pretty much useless. Fleet in Being is probably the only one that is somewhat usable because 10% naval hit chance and 10% torpedo hit chance is really good. And 10% less retreat chance is really good. It's just, when I see negative retreat speed, my skin crawls up. Because retreat speed is super important. If your navy is ever retreating, they will not fight back. They are just sitting ducks. It is really fucking bad. Like, you should still probably use night fighting, efficient communications, or brave commanders, depending on what type of game you're going for. But yeah, I mean, they exist, these Navy Spirits. Then we have Trade Interdiction, which has more retreat decision chance, which already is really bad. Then, okay, fleet speed while retreating and screening when only using capitals. I'd still rather have the good naval command spirits and then another 10% retreat chance after initial stage. Really bad. You don't want to retreat. And more retreat speed, that's good. Which, I guess for a base strike, you could use this for some hit and run tactics. But why would you run hit and run tactics with base strike? I guess if you're using light cruisers for detecting and then you have them retreat while your naval bombers are just decimating the enemy navy. But again, these are not... These are much better. Same thing with the Naval Academy. You get traits instead of a chance for more attack. And of course also with these, you get reduction costs for some of these designs instead of the modules, which I guess, like, that's kind of useful, but I still rather who cares? As for the rest of the spreadsheet, nothing too surprising here. Of course, Trade Interdiction has the best submarines, Fleet in Being has the best capital ships, and Base Strike has the best carriers and planes. This is already something I want to mention. Technically, Base Strike can be your best doctrine if you're not interested in Navy, just because your planes get 20% more naval targeting, or I suppose 40% more in regards to Fleet in Being. That is huge. We're gonna get into some tests over here later, but that already makes a very big difference. Okay, now to the bane of my existence. I tried testing this, but realistically, it is impossible to get perfectly accurate results. Unless I legitimately run 1 million tests per doctrine to make sure that any RNG involved can be neglected. But it's Navy! I'm gonna do all of this, and some guy in the comments is gonna type, I don't care, I'm gonna use submarines anyway! I'm trying to have fun in this game, okay? I almost fell asleep while editing the explanation of the tests, so they are in an unlisted video in the doobly-doo. And this makes this super annoying. For the most part, I try to keep everything on always engage, no retreat, and no reinforcements. But the big problem is just that there is so much RNG involved that you can't really test this. Every single thing I say here, take this with a spoonful of salt, then with some peanut butter, and then with more salt. Once again, I had to mod so much away that this is no longer accurate. This is only a rough estimate. These navies that I used, these were also the navies from my navy guide with 4 carriers, 20 battleships, and then 80 light cruisers. Just because that's what I usually use. Carriers, you should always run carriers. If you run 4 carriers, you have the perfect amount. Once you run 5, that's still fine. Once you run 6, you get into overstacking penalties, and then, you know, with battleships and the light cruisers, you can run any number that you want. But I still wanted to run a couple of battleships just to actually give Fleet in Being also something to gnaw on. And once again, the designs themselves you can look at in my Navy guide. After running this a couple of times, we can see that Fleet in Being loses completely against Base Strike just because the carriers are this strong. A lot of these battleships are pretty much dead, and you can see the screening ships are also pretty much gone. So it is relatively close. When you compare Base Strike and Trade Interdiction, it is honestly just a coin flip. It is very close. It actually does make a lot of sense because Base Strike does get 20% naval targeting instead of 40%. But it has better battleships and worse light cruisers, so it does make sense that it averages out about evenly with this Navy setup, which also explains why Trade Interdiction and Fleet in Being are about the same as Fleet in Being and Base Strike. You know, they are about even. Trade Interdiction is a little bit better if you run more submarines, and of course Base Strike if you run an actual Navy. And I also did some tests with Roach Destroyers. I personally use light cruisers any chance that I can because they have a much higher range, but DDs are a lot cheaper, and Fleet in Being actually benefits from them more than Base Strike because, you know, like, this is weighted towards Base Strike because they get proportionally more orc than the other doctrines get. But even with this one, Fleet in Being still lost here. And honestly, after all of this, I can't be arsed. There is a chance that I missed something, and you should never accept what I, or anyone else for this matter, says. At least not as the only truth. Do your own research, challenge what I say, challenge what other people say, and come to your own conclusions. Because there is always the chance that I missed something, and this doesn't even have to be malicious. Maybe I was just being an idiot. This is only one Navy setup. If we don't use carriers, of course, Base Strike is gonna lose all of these. If we use 200 battleships, and then 1,000 light cruisers, 800 light cruisers, then, you know, Fleet in Being should win because they benefit the most from this. This all was useless. Thank God I didn't spend 20 hours on this. But something that I personally find a little bit more interesting, which, you know, like with this we see that, yeah, it doesn't really matter that much for Navy combat if you have a balanced Navy. But one thing that is interesting is how does it perform in other tests? Trade Interdiction and Fleet in Being and Base Strike, they both get the same modifiers for submarines. And with this we can see a little bit of variance here. If you compare Trade Interdiction to Fleet in Being, this is not super accurate because, you know, there's a 9% difference and then suddenly an 18% and then we're down to 5%. I'm gonna be fair and say Trade Interdiction is 10% better at raiding than Fleet in Being. Of course, if you're raiding, it's still very nice. And then if we compare the naval bombers, I only compared Base Strike and no Doctrine. And, you know, Trade Interdiction will fall in a little bit of the middle because it has 20% instead of 40%. And here we can actually see that Base Strike is so insane. I don't know how long I let this run. It's probably like 2 months or something. We can see that Base Strike decimated the entire Navy. They did lose a lot fewer planes and they were quicker. It took Base Strike until the 30th of March, whereas No Doctrine took until the 17th of April, and there's still 12 battleships to destroy. They lost about 400 less planes, and these have already started attacking the light cruisers. And the light cruisers are very hard to kill with naval bombers just because they're so fast. Base Strike probably decimated this Navy even earlier than No Doctrine. This is a very good case for why Base Strike is so good even if you don't have a Navy. And then I also compared subs versus a strike force. No Doctrine lost 36 subs, Fleet in Being lost 30, and then Trade Interdiction lost 28. And we can see a lot of damage for Trade Interdiction here. With No Doctrine, we have about 31 light cruisers destroyed. A couple of these battleships are on death's door, and 1/3 of the light cruisers are also pretty much dead. Fleet in Being about the same, and Trade Interdiction actually dealt a lot of damage here because 2 battleships are already dead, and a lot of these battleships are very close to dying. If I let this run another month, there would be like 6-8 battleships more that would be dead, and this side would probably have like 4, 5. Trade Interdiction is really good if you're running submarines to... Where did you come from? Trade Interdiction is really good if you run submarines to destroy an enemy navy. But I would advise you to take a look at the plane damage because once again, really good. You know what's also really good? If you subscribe! After wasting so much time on researching this, which doctrine should you pick? Base Strike. Once you run Cavs, or you are not interested in any Navy at all, simply wanting to build some navs, then you should run Base Strike. The naval targeting makes this so good for nations that won't run a Navy. The best example I can give here is China. China is not gonna give 2 rats' asses about Japan. Like, sure, if you play China, you can build up a Navy and in 1950 invade the Japanese, but realistically, by that point, the Americans have already landed in Japan. So your best bet is to paradrop Japan, wait for the Allies to save you, or you get some roach battleships and just hope you can achieve some naval superiority. And in every single one of those cases, base strike would give you the most benefits. Sure, you can start building some dockyards and get out like 5 submarines before the Americans are in Japan, but you could also just soften the Japanese Navy up in the meantime, you know? Fleet in Being did lose on every front in these tests. So according to them, there is no place in this game for this doctrine. We have to be fair here. This is only one fleet composition that we tested, and there was a bunch of stuff that we commented out. If you have a bigger navy, carriers at some point will get a stacking penalty, but battleships will not. There is a penalty for having a larger navy than your enemy, but realistically that one doesn't matter. There's such a small modifier that this is perfectly fine. If you, the example that I gave earlier, if for some reason you can get 200 battleships into a battle, then you are gonna very much want Fleet in Being for this. Of course, Fleet in Being also gives you the benefit of not speccing into carriers, because without carriers you will decimate trade interdiction, and you will also, I mean, I guess you will decimate base strike even more. But I mean, if you're running a navy, you should still run carriers, even if you run Fleet in Being, because carriers are so strong, but you're less reliant on them. Yay, in a game, this will just be up to RNG. Trade interdiction can win against base strike can win against Fleet in Being can win against trade interdiction, and suddenly nothing makes sense anymore. And then of course, trade interdiction, if you spam subs and want to use an actual submarine navy, or you're running a little bit of a balanced navy. I would have liked to give a different answer, but this is your bread and butter for 90% of the games. Congratulations, you just wasted the last 10 minutes watching this video. This doctrine is obviously mainly focused on submarines, but it does give you decent bonuses all around, like the 30 org on light cruisers. You get a little bit of battleship buffs, you get 50 org on battleships, and then of course you also get some carrier buffs, and you still get the naval targeting. Like, it is genuinely a very middle of the pack doctrine. At that point, it's up to you whether you want to run a couple of submarines and use those to actually fight. If you want these to actually fight an enemy navy, then you should run trade interdiction. If you're only interested in using them to raid, I would probably still run base strike, just because base strike will be okay at it, at raiding convoys. And once again, you can actually do a lot more damage with the naval bombers from base strike. You know, like, that's honestly the one thing that you have to consider between base strike and trade interdiction. Do you want more submarines that are actually fighting navies, or do you want more naval bombers that will actually deal damage against enemy navies? Between Fleet in Being and the other ones, you picked Fleet in Being if you want to LARP as the Kaiser, I guess. I also compared the air doctrines over here, and I swear you will actually learn something from that one.